The next morning, I noticed the first warning signs of chaos. Cars hastily shuffled into driveways, others parked in far corners of a lot, and some residents even circled the streets repeatedly, hunting for legal spaces. The sense of urgency was palpable. Everyone was talking about the $300 towing fee, as if it were a personal threat aimed at them. That is when the HOA versus homeowner drama really began to unfold, and I knew the only way we'd survive the next few weeks intact was to understand the full scope of the board's new rule. A few days before this, Pinecrest had felt calm, almost idyllic. Streets lined with identical townhomes, neat landscaping, and quiet evenings. But under that surface, Mr. K and the board had been plotting what they saw as a necessary enforcement campaign to reduce overnight street congestion. They argued, citing safety concerns and potential insurance liability, but the sudden, heavy-handed timing suggested this was more about control than community well-being. Evidence of this control was clear in the memo. It referenced a board agenda excerpt approving immediate enforcement, with no community discussion. Neighbors began sharing whispers about the legality of such overnight restrictions. I overheard mentions of CCR Section 4.3, the rules regarding street use and resident parking. Most of us didn't fully understand the legalese, but the threat of instant towing created a pressure cooker. Cars weren't just being moved, they were symbols of autonomy under siege. The board's tone was petty, almost taunting, in the way it flaunted immediate consequences without warning or compromise. By the fourth day, tensions escalated when a local resident, Mrs. D, attempted to park near her townhouse at 1:45 a.m., only to be confronted by the security patrol hired by the HOA. The encounter was brief, but the intimidation was palpable. Her car now had a small final notice dated May 12th affixed under her wiper, a warning that she would face $300 towing fees if she didn't comply by the weekend. This was no longer a theoretical issue. Our HOA nightmare was manifesting in real, tangible consequences, and the social pressure from neighbors only amplified the stress. It became clear that this was about more than just parking. Karen neighbor drama was quietly emerging, too. One resident, known around the complex for her incessant complaints, began documenting every perceived violation. Her phone glowed constantly with notes, photos, and timestamps. She was ready to report anyone ignoring the new rules, and her involvement raised the stakes dramatically. The sense of surveillance was oppressive. Every step outside felt like potential evidence for a $300 fine. The first whispers of retaliation ideas began circulating among our street. My neighbors and I started noticing small patterns. Cars strategically parked just outside permit zones, shadowy discussions about petitions, and the quiet plotting of workarounds. It wasn't long before the first email appeared from a resident proposing a time challenge. If we could demonstrate that the board's enforcement was inconsistent or improperly documented, maybe we could push back. The idea ignited a spark of hope. Perhaps there was a way to turn HOA revenge story drama into a satisfying communal victory. I decided to start documenting everything myself. Every memo, every warning, every board agenda excerpt, and even the security patrol routes. I realized that evidence would be our best weapon. The pettiness of the board became a tool in itself. The more rigid and obsessive they acted, the more mistakes they made, giving us subtle openings. Every time a car was unjustly targeted, every time a notice had a date error, I logged it meticulously. This would become the foundation for our counterplay. At this point, the community was split. Some neighbors panicked, adhering strictly to the new overnight ban, moving their vehicles at odd hours. Others quietly resisted, parking strategically and testing the limits of the rules. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones about potential loopholes. It was petty, it was tense, and it was undeniably dramatic, the perfect storm for an HOA versus homeowner confrontation that would unfold in slow, suspenseful waves. Could a single documented misstep by the HOA be enough to invalidate $300 fines and expose board overreach? The thought lingered as I continued collecting evidence, noting every irregularity, and plotting a subtle escalation that might turn our collective frustration into a calculated form of petty justice. The nights became tense. I could hear cars starting, engines rumbling quietly as neighbors scrambled to comply or defy the rules. Even the sound of the wind against the street lamps seemed magnified, as if Pinecrest itself was holding its breath for the next move. The board's rigid enforcement, combined with Karen neighbor drama, created a pressure cooker where any wrong move could trigger fines or social shame. Our first real test came when a neighboring car was ticketed incorrectly, the wrong lot number cited, and the time of violation was off by nearly 20 minutes. The owner immediately emailed the board, highlighting the discrepancies. This was the first crack in the facade of control. Suddenly, the board's rigid rules were vulnerable to scrutiny, and I knew that if we played our cards right, the timing of our evidence could lead to a clever, satisfying blowback that might shift the balance of power in our favor. This was only the beginning. Small disputes over parking escalated quickly, neighbors arguing over who could legally leave their car where. Tension thickened during morning walks, as people exchanged glances filled with suspicion and irritation. The HOA nightmare had begun in earnest, and the next days would set the stage for a complex web of retaliation, loopholes, and calculated moves against the overbearing board. The stage was set for a Karen neighbor drama that was equal parts petty and suspenseful, a true HOA revenge story waiting to unfold. The next week brought a series of small, tense confrontations that seemed almost orchestrated by fate. Mr. K and the board remained steadfast, sending additional notices to residents they considered repeat offenders. Each notice carried the same stern language, reinforcing the threat of $300 towing fees and subtly reminding us that compliance was not optional. Yet, the overzealous tone only fueled conversations among neighbors about potential loopholes. The evidence I had been collecting, photographs of improperly marked zones, timestamps of patrols, and even dated notices, suddenly seemed more potent than ever. By midweek, the tension reached a boiling point when a heated argument erupted near the central parking area. One neighbor accused another of deliberately flaunting the rules, while the accused countered with proof that their vehicle had never violated the overnight restriction. It was petty, dramatic, and emblematic of HOA versus homeowner conflicts that could spiral into long-term disputes. I observed quietly, taking notes and capturing details that could support our growing sense of community resistance. This was no longer just about parking. It was a battle for autonomy and respect within our own neighborhood. As days passed, the board's enforcement intensified. New signage appeared, designating precise parking spaces with bold lettering and reflective tape. The message was clear: no exceptions would be tolerated. The winter wind added a biting edge to the scene, rattling the new signs as if underscoring the HOA's rigid stance. For many, this was a wake-up call that petty rules could have real consequences, and the threat of towing was a tangible, stress-inducing force. I noticed that some neighbors began documenting their own encounters with security, timing patrols, and noting inconsistencies. We were creating a web of evidence, slowly building a case to highlight the board's missteps. The atmosphere was thick with suspense and tension, yet there was a sense of camaraderie forming among those quietly resisting. It was a delicate balance between fear and defiance, a prelude to what would become a full-fledged HOA nightmare. Could careful documentation of board mistakes lead to the first victory for residents before more $300 fines accumulate? The possibility electrified us, turning casual whispers into focused strategy sessions and whispered debates over exact bylaw language. Every misstep the board made became an opportunity to turn their rigid enforcement into a liability. Then came the first formal petition. I helped organize neighbors to collect signatures, pointing out inconsistencies in notices and patrol timing. The petition cited evidence, including a board agenda excerpt noting immediate enforcement, and highlighted errors such as dated warnings and improperly marked parking zones. The goal was subtle but ambitious: to create a time challenge that would force the board to reconsider, or at least hesitate, before issuing additional fines. The board noticed the petition almost immediately. Mr. K responded with another stern memo, warning residents that petitions would not affect the enforcement timeline. But the memo itself contained a critical mistake. A misreferenced CCR Section 4.3, citing mailbox rules instead of parking regulations. This error did not go unnoticed, and it became the centerpiece of our argument. Evidence was now clearly on our side, and the tension between the board's authority and resident pushback intensified. Social pressure began to play a bigger role. Neighbors who had initially complied fully were now questioning whether blind obedience was worth the stress and potential embarrassment. Conversations about fairness, legal boundaries, and even petty revenge ideas began filling community forums and private chats. The once quiet cul-de-sac was now a hotbed of suspenseful, dramatic negotiations, with every resident weighing the risk of a $300 towing fee against the opportunity to challenge the board's overreach. The board's rigid enforcement created chaos, but every misstep they made provided leverage for residents. Petitions, evidence of improper notices, and documented patrols built a compelling case for challenging the overnight parking rules while planting seeds for subtle revenge. With momentum on our side, I started planning a strategic pushback. The first step was to coordinate timing. We had to demonstrate inconsistencies in enforcement without putting anyone at direct risk of towing. Neighbors agreed to stagger overnight parking in a carefully documented manner, creating a visual record of partial compliance and partial resistance. It was petty, clever, and deeply satisfying, a true HOA revenge story unfolding in real time. I also started drafting a formal complaint that combined the misdated final notice dated May 12th with photographic evidence of patrol errors. The goal was clear: to challenge fines based on procedural mistakes and create a situation where the board's authority could be questioned publicly. At the same time, small social maneuvers, like subtly drawing attention to the Karen neighbor drama, added a layer of tension, making the board appear increasingly rigid and overbearing in contrast to our organized resistance. Would orchestrated parking patterns and documented errors force the board to rescind fines and face public embarrassment? The excitement of seeing our small, calculated moves begin to unsettle Mr. K, and the committee kept morale high. Every neighbor who participated felt a growing sense of agency and anticipation for the next phase of our plan. The nights became our stage. Cars glided silently into carefully chosen spaces, flashlights captured evidence, and I made sure every misstep by security was logged. The winter air bit sharply, but the thrill of watching the board's control begin to waver outweighed any discomfort. Our HOA nightmare had become a suspenseful strategic game, and for the first time, the idea of satisfying retaliation seemed not only possible but imminent. By the end of the month, the stage was fully set for the next phase. Residents were aligned, evidence was meticulously organized, and the board's missteps were accumulating into a clear record of procedural errors. I could feel the anticipation building for what would be our first tangible success in this petty yet satisfying HOA versus homeowner saga. The atmosphere in Pinecrest was electric, a mixture of anxiety and excitement, as we prepared to challenge the board's authority in a way that would leave everyone talking for weeks. With the foundation laid, it was time to move from preparation to action. I coordinated with neighbors to submit a formal challenge, citing all inconsistencies: misdated final notice dated May 12th, improperly marked parking zones, and errors in patrol timing. The petition included 27 signatures, highlighting widespread concern and demonstrating that this wasn't an isolated complaint, but a collective pushback. The board received it midweek, and I could almost feel the tension ripple through Pinecrest as residents waited for their response. Simultaneously, we documented our staged overnight parking patterns. Every car was photographed at precise times, noting which vehicles were in compliance and which were following the time challenge. These images were compiled into a digital file to present to the board, effectively creating a living record of both adherence and resistance. The plan was methodical, suspenseful, and undeniably petty, the kind of HOA revenge story that kept everyone on edge. Could our organized documentation force the board to rescind fines and admit procedural errors publicly? It was the critical moment where patience, timing, and evidence would converge, and the first hints of victory were tantalizingly close. Every neighbor involved felt the anticipation in the cold winter air, the silence of the streets heightening the drama. The board called a special meeting in response to the petition. Residents arrived cautiously, some visibly anxious, others emboldened by the organized effort. I watched Mr. K shuffle papers, clearly unsettled, as I subtly referenced key evidence. The CCR Section 4.3 misquote, misdated notices, and the pattern of enforcement inconsistencies. The room hummed with tension, a combination of suspense, petty drama, and the thrill of watching overreach begin to unravel. When it came time to discuss fines, I presented the documented discrepancies. Silence filled the room as the board members reviewed photographic evidence and timelines. The result was immediate: acknowledgement of errors and a partial rescindment of fines, leaving the $300 towing threat suspended pending review. The reaction was almost cinematic, the board's rigid posture visibly cracking under the weight of our coordinated resistance. I could feel a wave of satisfaction wash over me as the meeting adjourned. The streets of Pinecrest seemed lighter, the tension of the previous weeks giving way to quiet triumph. Our calculated retaliation had worked. Careful planning, meticulous documentation, and a little bit of petty strategy had turned a rigid HOA enforcement into a moment of public accountability. It wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about asserting autonomy, holding authority accountable, and finding justice in a small but meaningful way. The Karen neighbor drama had also played out in interesting ways. Her attempts to escalate minor violations were neutralized by our evidence, subtly exposing the overreach to everyone present. While she remained a figure of scrutiny, the community now understood that unchecked complaints and obsessive enforcement could be countered strategically. Our HOA nightmare had transformed into a story of patience, cleverness, and ultimately satisfying revenge. In the aftermath, Pinecrest streets returned to their usual rhythm, though with a newfound respect for the boundaries between board authority and resident autonomy. Some neighbors continued to strategize cautiously, but the heavy-handed overnight towing threat had lost its immediate power. The cost of the conflict was minimal, some stress and sleepless nights, but the lessons were indelible. Evidence, timing, and community coordination could challenge even the most rigid HOA rules. Walking past the now quiet streets, I felt a reflective calm, knowing that careful planning had preserved our sense of control while delivering a satisfying, quiet victory. Tell me your HOA horror in one line and see if you could survive the same chaos. Looking ahead, Pinecrest will undoubtedly face new challenges, perhaps a rule on holiday decorations or a debate over fence height, but the community has learned a valuable lesson. The next story promises more drama. A solar panel dispute at Lakeshore gated community where board rules, neighbor rivalry, and clever loopholes will collide, and the suspense is only beginning.